Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in about 3 minutes here, so at 10:02. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in about 1 minute here. Morning, everyone. I think we'll get started now. So welcome to today's IFO Group webinar on the important topic of methylene chloride TSCA regulation. I'm your moderator, Melissa Wieseman, and I'm excited that you joined us today. Before we begin the education portion of the webinar, I'd like to cover some housekeeping topics just to ensure we have a smooth experience for everyone involved. Today's presentation will run for approximately 40 minutes. And then following the presentation, we reserved 20 minutes for Q&A. If you have questions at any time during the presentation, please use the raise hand icon as well as the chat feature in Teams to state your question. Raising your hand will put your question in queue for us to select from after the presentation ends. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible during the Q&A segment. Any question that is unanswered during the webinar will be responded to after the event has finished. To avoid interruptions, we will be muting all participants during the presentation. However, we encourage you to engage with questions and comments in the chat bar. Lastly, I'd like to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded for future reference. Following the event, we will share a link to the recording, allowing you to revisit the valuable insights shared today. Before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to introduce you to our speaker, Sarah Anderson. Sarah is an experienced health, safety, integrity, and environmental executive. She is a certified industrial hygienist and holds several other certifications, including certified fire investigator, incident commander for industrial incidents, as well as a certified radiation safety officer. Throughout her career, Sarah has held key leadership roles with renowned organizations such as Alcoa, Amoco, BP, Shell, and SGS Group, showcasing strong management, communication, and technical skills. As a principal consultant at the IFO Group since May of 2020, Sarah specializes in PSM and RMP program development, compliance, and auditing. Her expertise extends to culture change management, industrial hygiene, and incident investigation. She also serves as an HSE lead auditor, project manager, and risk assessor, contributing to a holistic approach to health, safety, and environmental consulting. Sarah currently acts as the lead on the AIHA TSCA Task Force for Regulatory Interpretation for the recently announced TSCA regulations. With a Master of Science in Public Health from the University of North Carolina and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Health from Purdue University, Sarah brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to her consulting services. And now, without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Melissa. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Wonderful. And thanks to all joining today. I'll try to keep this within 30 to 40 minutes. I know that everyone's busy and I appreciate you having some of your time here with me today. I'm going to be spending detailed review over this new methylene chloride standard that was issued recently from EPA under the TSCA rule. This regulation does not apply to anyone that's involved with the pesticides under FIFRA Act or with Cosmetics and Food and Drug Act. So if you are part of those industries, the methylene chloride standard is excluded from those types of operations. So I just wanted to give you that as a ripcord if you're joining and it does not apply to you. If you are not in either of these sectors and you do have methylene chloride in use, this regulation probably does apply to you. And I hope that this will be helpful for you in understanding what you need to do to be compliant with these EPA regulations. So basically, in summary, with this act, it prohibits the manufacturing and processing and distribution of methylene chloride for all consumers down the road. And it also prohibits most industrial and commercial use of methylene chloride. There are provisions in place which EPA is calling workplace chemical protection programs for companies that continue to use methylene chloride instead of banning it from complete use. And the WCPPs is what they call it, include the requirement to monitor exposures, and they have set their own exposure limits. So most of us are used to having compliance with OSHA PELs or ACGIH TLVs. EPA is stepping into the workplace now under the Lautenberg Act. They included a specific terminology covering workers in the workplace. So now they've extended their reach and are establishing what they call existing chemical exposure limits, or ECHLs, for certain chemicals. And this is one of two that have been issued already. The other one is asbestos. And I'll be doing a webinar on that one in the future. But just as an overview, workplace chemical protection programs include ECHLs that EPA has established that are lower than the PELs that OSHA has established. They include specific monitoring requirements with excessive detail that's required when we're doing our monitoring. So if those of you attending today are traditional industrial hygienists and that's your background or you've had experience in that area, EPA is adding a lot more detail and a lot more requirements in the monitoring scope of work that's outlined in the workplace chemical protection programs and plans, which I'll be going through later on in this presentation. There are detailed requirements outlining exposure controls and how you need to assess them and implement them and maintain documentation regarding those. And then extra record keeping requirements, including notification of people that may be using your product downstream, details on the processing information and distribution within commerce. And I'll be going into details on each of those elements so you have an understanding of the actions that you need to take to be in compliance with this new standard. This standard applies to methylene chloride products that have 0.1% or greater concentration of methylene chloride. So it's a good thing that EPA did implement a de minimis requirement for methylene chloride. They did not do that for asbestos. So I'm thankful that this one has a de minimis. So if you have less than 0.1% methylene chloride, it's excluded from this standard, and you don't need to worry about all the compliance and all the controls that need to be implemented if it's at 0.1% or greater. This applies to manufacturers, including importers of chemicals or products that have 0.1% or greater methylene chloride, producers, distributors, users, and even people that have to handle waste products on the disposal end. This applies to them as well. So pretty much anyone that handles chemicals with 0.1% or greater methylene chloride in the processing, in the use down the road, or in the disposal, have to comply with this standard. Compliance deadlines. This was issued May 8th of this year. The rule goes into effect July 8th, so very soon, about a month. And manufacturers must revise their safety data sheets by October 7th of 2024. There's specific verbiage that has to be inserted into your existing safety data sheets for any products that have 0.1% or greater methylene chloride. Processors and distributors also have to revise their safety data sheets by December 4th of 2024. So depending upon where you may lie in the production side, you have different deadlines. So make sure you understand if you're a manufacturer or a processor or a distributor so that you meet the deadlines that apply to you. Similar exposure groups and initial monitoring must also be conducted no later than May 5th of 2025. So you do have some time to get your plans in place for monitoring and compliance, but I would recommend that you get started the sooner the better. There are some exemptions. I have not listed all of them, but an example here is EPA is providing some exemptions for federal governments and their contractors due to like red tape and a lot of hoops that they have to jump through to be compliant with this, with extra like year for compliance. So for government industries and contractors, their workplace chemical protection programs have to comply by November 9th of 2026, and then other later dates for complete compliance with the program. And I'll be going into details of the workplace chemical protection program for you to understand what you need to do. This is our examples of the coverage for methylene chloride for where you need to apply workplace chemical protection programs. So pretty much anywhere that you have 0.1% or greater of methylene chloride in the production, handling, use, or disposal, you have to develop a chemical protection program. Now, you're asking probably what does that involve? And I'll go into that in the next few slides. And these are examples of where those chemical protection programs apply. A lot of industries have methylene chloride in the production or use of refrigerant chemicals. Battery operations, they're used as a processing aid. Many labs that are not pharmaceutical labs or food and drug labs or pesticide labs use methylene chloride in their operations. They are also included in this standard and used as a solvent in welding. So take a look at the operations that are going on in your industry or workplace. And a simple place to start is if it's not in your processes in bulk, you might want to look at your safety data sheet index and do a search for methylene chloride and see what you might have at your work site. This is basically an outline of what the Workplace Chemical Protection Program requires. So you're required to conduct initial monitoring and similar exposure group development by May 5th of 2025. The monitoring applies to users. So those are people that could be exposed to methylene chloride based upon the work that they're doing, maintenance or operations standard. And it also includes things like shutdowns and turnarounds and unusual malfunctions. So any part of the process, whether or not it's routine, is covered by this standard. If you have exposure limits that exceed the ECHL, which is 2 parts per million for the EPA exposure limit for methylene chloride, and the STEL is 16 parts per million with an action level of 1 part per million. So it's very much aligned with kind of OSHA's criteria with the half of the ECHL as the action limit. If you have exposure limits above those, you might need to consider extending your monitoring beyond the users to people that might be in the work zone or area where those samples exceeded those limits to make sure that they're covered as well. So depending upon your monitoring results, you may have to expand the population people that you're doing the initial monitoring for. In accordance and requirements for EPA, you have to apply the hierarchy of controls to ensure that no person's exposed at or above the 2 parts per million limit or the 16 parts per million after August 1st. So it's a pretty quick timeline from May completion of monitoring to June, July, August to like 3 months or less to get that implemented for your hierarchy controls applied. So I strongly recommend that you, if this applies to you, you do your monitoring as soon as possible so you can identify areas where you need to do the assessment and application of the hierarchy of controls so that they can be applied no later than August 1st to get the ECHLs and STELs below those established limits. The hierarchy controls have to be applied to ensure that no person is exposed above those limits 90 days after initial monitoring or no later than May 5th. And the exposure control plans have to be implemented by October 30th of 2025. And you have to document. This is one change that's kind of extreme and a bit laborious is you have to document all the reasons why you've selected certain controls. And you also have to document why you didn't implement certain controls, what you considered and was not implemented, and the reasoning why those controls were not implemented. So it's very detailed, and you're going to need to have some kind of a system to manage the work product from these requirements. You have to also conduct specific training for methylene chloride for anyone that handles it or could be exposed to it. And there are specific record keeping and notification requirements that are outlined as well, which we'll go through later on in this presentation. The TSCA exposure control plan documentation, I've parsed it out. There are 6 elements that you need to document and retain those records for at least 5 years. I would say, keep it forever. Once you've got it documented, have some kind of a retention software or database that you can just keep it for duration. But you need to identify the exposure controls that you've considered. And you also have to document those that were not used and write down the reasoning why. And you need to use the basic hierarchy of controls, which is the elimination, substitution, engineering controls, work practices, administrative controls, and then PPEs, the last line of defense, right? Then for each exposure control that you've considered, you have to write down and document why it was selected or why it wasn't selected based on the feasibility or cost, effectiveness of those controls, and any other relevant considerations. You need to also document a description of how the controls will be implemented by operations, by maintenance, by inspections group. And you have to include documentation of installation to make sure verification that things are installed correctly. You need to set up routine inspections of the controls that are in place, especially like engineering controls. You need to set up usually quarterly checks of certain things to make sure they're still in operation and verification. You have to conduct training on the controls for the end users so that they know how to use it, and also conduct training for maintenance people or whoever's going to be in charge of conducting the inspections so that they know the frequency of inspections, what they're inspecting, and basically how it's supposed to operate and any other actions that are applicable. You also need to define regulated areas. So this is similar to the OSHA regulated areas. If you have locations that exceed the ECHL or exceed the EPA STEL, you need to demarcate a regulated area. EPA does not specify specific verbiage for the sign. So I would default to the OSHA verbiage because they are very specific with what needs to be stated on their regulated areas. But you need to demarcate those areas as well. And you need to make sure specific people who are authorized to work in those regulated areas are defined. So you can't just say operators or maintenance personnel. You actually have to list out who is approved for entry into those regulated areas. And EPA also requires that postings of regulated areas have to be in languages that are common at your site. So if you have a percentage of people that speak Spanish at your location, you also need to post those regulated area signs in Spanish as well as English. Description of activities conducted by the people that are working with the methylene chloride products or products that contain methylene chloride. You have to put in a control plan, an exposure control plan, and communicate that and identify the activities that are conducted by maintenance, operations, contractors, etc. And then have a control plan defined for all of the different tasks and activities to make sure that people are being protected from excessive exposures through these different controls that you've identified through this workplace chemical protection program. And you have to confirm that everyone is properly implementing these controls. So you not only do you have to make sure they're installed correctly, people receive the training, you have to go out and verify that things like a fume hood is being used as designed. You have to verify it. So you have to put a program together to verify that the controls that you've identified are actually in place and operators are using them as they're required. You also need to have procedures for any changes that could increase potential exposure to methylene chloride in place. So like a management exchange program needs to cover this aspect of the TSCA program. So I'm sure most of you have a formal MOC program in place. You just need to incorporate exposures to methylene chloride into that procedure to cover those changes and make sure that they're documented for verification. And it includes procedures for implementing corrective actions. So if you make any kinds of corrective action changes to manage the exposure to methylene chloride, you need to make sure those are documented as well. So a lot of procedures need to be put into place, a lot of documentation, and a lot of field work needs to be done to be in compliance with this standard. A lot of the standard is aligned with the OSHA methylene chloride standard. It's just lower exposure limits and a lot more documentation and defined requirements regarding controls and assessment of the workplace. Exposure control plan requires that you cannot control exposures through personnel rotation. It's the same as the methylene chloride standard for OSHA, so no change there. You cannot rotate people in and out as a means of controlling exposures. And the people that are in charge of the site, like owners of the site or contractors that work in the site, must make sure that the controls that they have implemented and identified are effective, like we in step 5 of the previous slide. You also have to revisit the exposure control plan that you put in place every 5 years or whenever things might change that could increase exposures and you need to put in different controls. So this is it's not a once and done thing. You have to revisit it every 5 years at a minimum. You also need to make available the information that you are generating from this exposure control plans to personnel that are impacted by it. So your operators, maintenance, engineering, anyone that's working in areas that they could be potentially exposed to methylene chloride have the right to access the exposure monitoring records, access to the respiratory program implementation, which should be the same as the OSHA methylene chloride respiratory program. They do reference OSHA's respiratory program for compliance. It's just this lower exposure limit that we've got to meet. And then also a formal dermal protection program implementation. So you just have to document formally your controls for gloves, glove use, glove application, specific materials that you're using for gloves and the expectations there, if that applies. And owners and operators, you have to notify potentially exposed people. So when you conduct the monitoring, we have to notify people within usually 15 days of the exposure monitoring. But if people are requesting the records, you need to provide them with the records within 30 days of request. Oh, wait, no, I think that's within 15 days. Sorry, we'll get to that. It's in a different slide. But once you've finalized your workplace chemical protection program, yeah, any of those records within 30 days of the date that exposure control plan is completed, that's made available to people that could be impacted, and annually thereafter. So I recommend that you put in a training program that includes sharing of all that information so that you meet this requirement. Yeah, and whenever somebody requests any information that applies to them from this, within 15 working days, you need to give them that information. Exposure monitoring record requirements. So for those of us who traditionally do the industrial hygiene monitoring, this is the same type of monitoring, but lower levels of exposure. And then also a lot more detail is being required to be documented for these monitoring events. And they also require you to go out and check on the monitoring, like on an hourly basis, to make sure your pumps are working and to get information about the tasks that are being conducted by the operations. And also you need to collect things like the temperature, humidity, ventilation rates. If it's an indoor place, you need to, calculate what the air changes per hour, or if it's local ventilation, you got to verify that it's running and collect measurements for that type of ventilation. You also need to collect data on the process, like how much methylene chloride is in the lines. What are they doing? What's their exposure potential? How long do they do certain tasks, and how frequent are they doing those tasks in a week or in a month or throughout the day? So there's a lot more information that is outlined and specified in this standard that must be collected when you're conducting this monitoring. So make sure when you are doing this monitoring that you're collecting all of the details required, and you're going to have to take the time and dedicate people to being out in the field to do this. It's quite intensive beyond what we are normally used to for industrial hygiene monitoring. You need to also identify other potentially exposed people with similar or representative exposures. We're used to this with the SEGs, but we can't just say operators and olefins 1. You have to identify each individual person that is exposed and is represented. You can't just say operators. So you need to work with HR to get the list of people as a reference to make sure you're compliant with this standard. And I also recommend that when you're doing the monitoring, you comply with the good laboratory practice standards, because that brings you into basic compliance with the expectations that they're outlining. And then you must use an AAHA accredited lab for sending your samples in for analysis. And yeah, I also have to write down all the details regarding the air monitoring equipment and media and the methodology used. And that's all wrapped up into compliance with the GLP or good lab practice standards. So if you hire somebody to do this monitoring and they're GLP compliant, they will know to do all of this that's required within this TSCA regulation. Notifications must be provided to the people that you're monitoring and to similar exposure groups. So if you're taking representative sampling of operators or maintenance, you need to make sure that all those people that have similar exposures get notification, and you can do that through like a standard generic posting in the work areas that they can look at and see that, oh, monitoring was done for maintenance in the olefins area or whatever area applies, and that it applies to everyone that conducts maintenance or these tasks. So that's also included. Monitoring is required for personal exposures. It is not required for area exposures unless you're setting up things like your regulated areas. You need to do monitoring for that. But basically, this requires that every person that could be exposed to methylene chloride or could be potentially exposed has to be monitored for what their exposure is to verify that exposures are below the ECHL or the EPA STEL. You can either sample everybody or you can sample representative samples, but if you're doing representative sampling, it has to be a worst case scenario where they have the highest potential exposure. It has to be representative of the work that's being conducted by other people in that SEG. And it has to represent the same task, day shift, night shift, swing shifts, anything. It has to be representative. If the work is not representative across shifts, then you're going to have to monitor each of the shifts and each of the tasks if it's not representative or the highest potential exposure. So a lot of potential monitoring there. I've highlighted option C because that to me is the most reasonable option, is by monitoring someone that has the worst case exposure, does the same tasks across all shifts. So if your operators are conducting the same tasks at night shift as compared to day shift and nothing's different, and the worst case exposures occurred during day shift, you can monitor that particular operator and have that be representative of all the operations day and night shift. You can use past data that you've collected to verify that you are not exceeding the ECHLs, but most of the monitoring that we have done in the past was for the OSHA PEL, which is much higher than this one. So you're probably more than likely going to have to do monitoring in compliance with this EPA ECHL. But if you have data that's been generated within the past 5 years before May 8th of 2024, that complies with all the expectations regarding, you have information on the methodology used, the samples were sent to an AIHA accredited lab, you have all the detail included that's required now, like process information, ventilation information, temperature, humidity, all that. If you have all of that information from your previous monitoring, then you can apply that. If not, you're going to have to start from scratch and do more monitoring. If you have real-time direct read monitoring, you can use that to show that you've got no exceedances over the ECHL and for fewer than 30 days. So if you have exposures, say, for certain tasks, like somebody is unloading a tanker that has some methylene chloride in it, and they do that once a month, that's less than 30 days out of the year. And if your exposures are well below the ECHLs, then you can say that they're good. And you can document that direct reading devices and those results as being compliant. I am not going to go through this slide. It outlines all the basic monitoring requirements for different conditions based on the results. So for example, if you have initial exposure monitoring and the concentration results are below the ECHL action level and it's below the STEL, then you only have to do periodic monitoring every 5 years, okay? But you can go through this list, and depending upon your monitoring results, it's going to define your frequency of monitoring for that specific job task location. Exposure monitoring results notification, very much like OSHA. Whenever you do the monitoring, you need to share the results with the people that are represented by that monitoring and to the individual monitored. And you have to let them know if there are excessive exposures, the specific controls that you're going to put into place and the corrective actions that you're going to implement to reduce their exposures. And they have to be notified within 15 working days after you receive the results in writing or in posted in a control room, for example, to share with everybody that could be potentially exposed to those same limits. If you have an exceedance, like I said, you have to share with them the corrective actions that you are taking to implement to get their exposures reduced. And of course, then you're going to have to do monitoring again on the frequency defined in the previous table. And you also have to post notification in multiple languages if there are a certain number of people that speak non-English, so that everybody has the awareness of the results. Respiratory protection, here's another table that's been put together by EPA for compliance. It basically follows the same requirements as OSHA .134 and the OSHA methylene chloride standard. You can only use supplied air, and the only difference really is the compliance with the new ECHL and the EPA STEL. And then you have to provide respiratory protection if you have inhalation exposures above the ECHL or STEL within 3 months after receipt of the results of any exposure monitoring. So you make sure you are paying attention to your monitoring results and implementation of corrective actions per the timelines. Obviously, you're more than likely going to need to put in engineering controls if you have levels that are that high, because the use of supplied air permanently is not really convenient. For the private sector, this compliance requirement is within 15 months after the May 8th date, and then federal agencies have an extra time frame to comply with that. Regulated areas, I talked about this briefly earlier, but you must demarcate any area where the airborne concentrations of methylene chloride can exceed the ECHL or the EPA STEL. You have to demarcate the regulated areas within 3 months after you get confirmation that exposure monitoring indicates the exceedances. And you need to identify the people, the individuals that are qualified or authorized to enter those areas. Those people just have to have the training and the awareness and the capability to protect themselves if they're going into those regulated areas. So you need to document those individuals and have that in record. And you have to have signs in English and another language if there's a prevalent language also at the site. And that's pretty much it. There's no specific verbiage, like I said, but I would recommend you follow the verbiage from the OSHA methylene chloride standard, which is very specific. These are general record keeping requirements. Like I said, there's a lot of paperwork and record keeping that you're going to need to comply with. Anyone that handles methylene chloride, you have to, or ships it out, processes it, and distributes it in commerce. You've got to have documentation that shows who you're sending methylene chloride to. So probably your procurement department, your shipping department will need to manage this. You have to, a copy of the notification has to be provided per this reg to the recipients of the methylene chloride products that you're shipping out. And you also have to keep track of how much methylene chloride has been shipped. And you have to keep records of that for compliance. And you also have to, for the purchasing of it, you have to, on that end, you also have to keep those records for how much you're purchasing and how much is coming in. And this part is complying with the prohibition that comes down the line for certain things. Exposure control records, obviously, you have to retain records of the exposure control plan that you're going to be putting together, and the implementation, the inspections, all the evaluations, and the verification that things are effective, and confirmation of training. You have to document the PPE that you're using and the verification that it's adequate, and it includes the requirements for fit testing and medical surveillance, medical approvals. So basically, you have to comply with the OSHA respiratory protection standard and document that. And you have to also document any changes outside of routine operations and how you are going to be managing potential excessive exposures during shutdowns, turnarounds, startups, malfunction exposures, out the maintenance work. You have to document all of that information on how you're managing the exposures during those activities as well. Objective data, that's your historical data. If it applies, you can use it to say that you're within compliance. Most people aren't going to be able to use objective data because they just don't have the details necessary to back it up that it's applicable and in compliance with these expectations. This is basically an outline of the record retention requirements for the workplace chemical protection program. So you've got your exposure control plans. I highly recommend that you conduct a formal evaluation, much like process hazard analysis, and apply it to methylene chloride potential exposure in the workplace for every single task and all the locations that could have potential exposure to methylene chloride, and document it in the same way as you would a PHA, and go through each and every potential exposure like you would in a PHA for your process. You're going to need to document your regulated areas and the authorized personnel that are authorized to enter those. You need to document your facility exposure monitoring records and keep those, and the notification of that information. You need to document your evaluation and application of personal protective equipment, including respiratory protection and gloves that you might be implementing and using, and retaining information on the training that you've conducted under both the methylene chloride standard, the respiratory protection standard, and this standard regarding the program and controls. Business record retention is also required by other departments, such as your purchasing and procurement. They have to retain invoices of what is coming in regarding methylene chloride and any bills of lading. So this is in regards to compliance with the prohibition that's coming down of use of methylene chloride, to make sure that you are not purchasing it or using it or distributing it in the future after the prohibition dates. And you need to retain those records 5 years from the date the record is generated. Again, I'm a proponent of keeping your records forever, just to make sure there's no question. And this requirement begins July 8th of this year. Access to records, exemptions, and retention. Basically, anyone that could be exposed to methylene chloride has the right to access any of the information to help them understand it. And you have to retain these records for 5 years. And then you also have to provide people with the information requested within 15 working days of receiving that request. This is just reference material on different OSHA standards that are referenced within the TSCA standards. So we've got PPE, respiratory protection, methylene chloride standards that are referenced. So basically you have to comply with all these in addition to what EPA is recommending or requiring, actually. So that's 40 minutes. I am done with the formal presentation part. I don't know if there are any questions, but Melissa, if we can open up to any questions, that would be great. And if you want to contact me afterwards, this is my information for you to call me or send me an email.
Thanks, Sarah. That was fantastic. So I don't see any questions in the chat or Q&A yet. If anybody has any, feel free to type them into the chat feature right now, and we can get them answered. Otherwise, like Sarah said, you can contact her after the fact. So I'll leave it for 1 minute here, and then if not, we can end things for today.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming and staying on with the webinar. I really appreciate it.
I see Sharon raised her hand. Sharon, let me see if I can unmute you. Okay, I just unmuted Sharon. If you'd like to speak, you should be able to.
I don't hear Sharon.
Yeah, I don't see it either. Let me look in the Q&A box here. It looks like, oh, Sharon's looking. Stephen Craig, can you
hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Your meeting chat is turned off, or I would have just chatted this.
Oh.
Do you expect to have any kind of template that we can work off for the control documentation? Because it's a lot of information that we have to use. Is that something that might be available to any of us?
Yeah, as part of the AIHA TSCA workforce, we're creating tools to help people comply with the standard and with the other ones that are coming out. A template is one of them. We're putting together things for making sure when you're doing monitoring, all of the elements that are required by TSCA are on that monitoring form. But regarding like the controls and assessment, that kind of a template is not being developed yet, but it's something that I think some of the PHA software programs should be working on if they're forward thinking. Did that answer your question, Sharon?
Yeah, it's just a lot for the documentation part, and it would be helpful if we had a little bit more guidance on that. But
Okay.
also for processes where we're working with dichloromethane, but the product that we're shipping out, we don't believe it. We believe it's below 1%. We're not required under any of those, like the safety data sheet or any of those things, just if our product included dichloromethane over.
Yeah, so if it's below 0.1%,
Okay.
you do not have to include it. And that was really good that EPA included that de minimis for this one, because they did not include that grace for asbestos.
If anyone has any questions as well, use the Q&A chat. That's not muted, so you can quickly ask questions within that area.
Lori, I don't mean to call you out, but I know that you're deeply involved with a lot of this. Do you have any comments that maybe I did not cover for the methylene chloride standard?
I have to unmute her, and I can do so right now. Okay, Lori should be unmuted.
No, I think you did a great job. I think that you covered all the bases. I think everything is was very eloquent, and the explanations were good, and I don't have anything to add.
Oh, well, that made my day, Lori. Thank you. Yeah, Lori's an expert in this area, as are many of us on the call. So it's always a challenge to present to peers. So I appreciate all of you being here.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions. So if there's nothing else, we can wrap up the webinar, and then we will send out this link after the fact, and then a copy of the presentation will go out as well. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to attend this. With that, I will end it. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.